We're now at our second session, which is entitled State Governments, How Bad Is It? The Role of State Governments in Infrastructure, Science, and Education. Another way of subtitling this particular session is how much has the crisis and the response to it stolen from the future, because we're talking about investments that prepare the way for a better future. We have three panelists, Gary Demiski, who is the founding director of the University of California Center at Sacramento and teaches at the University of California at Riverside. Next to him is Robert Ward, who's the deputy director of the Rockefeller Institute of Government, and he heads the Institute's state and local government finance research there. And then Catherine Newman, who is the James B. Knapp Dean of the Krieger School of Arts and Sciences at the Johns Hopkins University, who recently moved from Princeton University and has worked a long time on poverty and the working poor. We'll start off with Robert Ward, who will give us a broad overview of the fiscal situation of the states, then move to Catherine Newman, and then conclude with Gary, who's going to make this all much more specific by focusing on telling the new or old California story, depending how you see it.
Thank you very much. It's a pleasure to be with all of you today. I am going to, as promised, talk about the sort of a broad picture for state and local governments. Let me say at the outset, for those of you who may not be aware, that the Rockefeller Institute is part of the State University of New York. We are a research organization that we say that our motto is we educate, we do not advocate. So what I will try to do here today is explain how we see the picture for state and local governments, talk a little bit about some of the implications and different ways of looking at the way forward without really advocating any particular path. So although we talk about states, what we really mean, of course, is the combined picture of state and local governments. And this is the only slide that I'm going to refer your attention to. And I'll go back to this later on, but I think it's useful to just understand what has been the long-term trend in the level of state and local government resources relative to the size of the economy. Some people think that taxes have been cut. Some people think that taxes have been increased. And really the long-term picture is that tax revenues have risen quite nicely over the long term. And whether you put those in nominal terms or adjust for inflation plus population, when you look at taxes as a share of the economy, it's really striking how the figure has remained pretty constant for a long period of time now. And again, I'll get back to that a little bit later in my presentation. But let me just start out by saying, and some of this was covered earlier, the revenue crisis for states is over in the sense that starting at the end of 2008, we had 5 straight quarters of decline. Calendar year 2009 was a horrendous year for states. Overall tax revenues fell by 12% during that year. And in a normal year, well, in recent history, states had seen revenues rise by somewhere in the range of 5 to 6%. So when you combine a 12% decrease in nominal collections with what would have been an expected 5 to 6%, you obviously get something in the range of a 17 to 18% shortfall in terms of what states could reasonably have expected to have by way of a level of resources. And contrast that larger gap with the difficulty that states have in dealing with a normal budget problem when there's a soft recession and revenues go down by a couple of percentage points. States really often have a hard time closing even that level of a gap. They nibble away here, nibble away there. They add a little revenue here, a little revenue there, and it's a politically difficult thing to do. So certainly, this I think helps us understand why the political picture has become so difficult and in some ways perhaps poisonous because states have been dealing with a problem the size of which they had not seen since the Depression. We now have the data for calendar year 2010. Tax collections were up modestly by about 4% for the full year. So again, the crisis is over in terms of further decline for states, but if you put that 4% gain in the context of a 12% drop, and you still are down some from the heights. We have early data now for the first couple of months of 2011. It looks like the first quarter revenues will be up something in the range of 9% compared to a year ago. So perhaps by the end of this year, all the states will be back up to where they started. But again, a couple of years have gone by. So for some states, it'll be 3 years of the period required to get back to the pre-recession highs. So states are still climbing out of a hole. Local governments have a very different picture. State taxes are based primarily, and I think most people here probably know this, on the income tax and the sales tax. These revenues are fairly closely track the economy, so they're relatively contemporaneous with the state of the economy. Local government revenues, much more heavily reliant on the property tax. That tends to lag the economy by 2 to 3 years. So right now we are seeing the impact on local government revenues. And in fact, in the last quarter of 2010, we saw property tax collections nationwide decline by 3%. That was the first decline in property taxes we had seen in almost 10 years. It's pretty unusual for property tax collections to go down on a year-over-year basis, but we are now seeing that. And of course, given the range and the variation in the extent to which the housing market collapse hurt different areas of the country, some jurisdictions are suffering very badly from that. So if we think of local governments and states as a unified fiscal system, which they are, it's still a very troubled picture. And from the local government perspective, municipalities and school districts, the bad news will be compounded this year by the fact that most state governments are likely to enact reductions in state aid. So local governments, your two main sources of revenue, property tax and state aid, you're likely to see bad news on both of those fronts this year. So over the next couple of years, we expect that, again, the picture for states will continue to brighten somewhat, but certainly not time yet to say that happy days are here again. Local governments, continued trouble. So overall, a very clouded picture. In the long term, if you believe the Government Accountability Office, state and local governments face continued very serious fiscal problems over the next several decades, primarily as a result of rising health care costs, both for publicly funded health care and Medicaid and other programs, as well as for health care costs for public employees. This is a picture that a lot of scholars have pointed to, the issue of pension costs, where we want to ascribe the blame, if blame is appropriate, is a different question. The fact is that pension costs are rising dramatically. In New York City next year, pension costs will be equal to about 20% of local tax revenues. New York City has pretty high taxes, so 20% of tax revenues is a very big chunk of that budget. So how are states responding to these challenges? And one of the key points that I want to leave with you today is the idea that states respond to these things in very different ways. And we have had an awful lot of attention in recent weeks and months on a few states in particular. Wisconsin, Ohio, some other states where the budgetary discussions have been extraordinarily politicized. And so people focus on the political questions, which of course is appropriate, but it gets us away from analyzing these issues, looking at these issues in a more analytical way. And that's what we try to do at the Rockefeller Institute. So what does this variation mean? Well, again, states and localities are going to be dealing with extraordinarily difficult problems this year, almost certainly the following year, very possibly for many years to come. And what are states doing this year? Well, a lot of states are enacting very significant cuts to education and other programs. Texas is looking at education cuts of 9% or more. Pennsylvania, they're looking at education cuts of about 8%. The budget just adopted in New York includes a reduction of about 6%. And just as an illustration of what that means, about 3/4 of the school districts in New York will receive less in state aid this year than they did 2 years ago. So again, when you assume that costs tend to rise over time, even setting aside the extraordinary increase in pension and health care costs, it is a very significant challenge. And again, this is happening at a time when in many jurisdictions the local property tax base is weakening. We have 50 states in this country with very different political cultures. And again, we will see very different actions, very different responses to these challenges from in Massachusetts compared to Mississippi, in New York compared to New Jersey. So this is right now, I think we would probably all agree, it appears unlikely that we're going to have, at least in the near future, a major national response to these fiscal problems facing the states and localities. We arguably have entered upon a period of national debate over the relationship between the federal government and the state and local governments. I would suggest that's a good thing. People come down on different sides, but it's a sort of discussion that we need to have periodically in this country. But let's assume that at least for the near future, we're not going to see any major federal assumption of costs in Medicaid, for instance, or any major new form of federal revenue sharing with the states. What we are going to see, I would suggest to you, is to some significant extent that we can't portray accurately yet, or can't identify, we're going to see a reversal of the social contract that we have seen in this country for the last 50 years or so. Starting in the 1960s, we, in many ways, expanded the role of government in the private sector, Medicare and Medicaid, obviously, key parts of that. And we also shifted a lot of costs, particularly to the federal level. If you look at this slide here, it goes back to 1961, and back then, state and local government tax revenue was somewhere between 7 to 7.5% of GDP. During the 60s and early 70s, it jumped up to something in the range of between 9 and 10%. And since the late 70s has been more or less holding steady in the range of between 8.5 to 9, maybe 9.5%. So this has been something that we've gotten used to. When the economy is good, tax revenues climb real strongly. I come from New York, where when Wall Street booms, the revenues come flooding in. Same is true in some other states. But over time, it's been a relatively strong rate of growth as the economy has grown. Obviously, when the economy goes down, the revenues go down. But, thank you. So we have seen this significant change over that period. I think we are facing a period where we're going to see, we very well may possibly see a change, a reversal of that. And this raises the question as to what are the choices that are going to be made during this period. There are two broad sets of choices. One is, what is the overall balance of revenue and expenditures? And many of the discussions today are about sort of based on the concept that we need more revenues. Well, we're going to have to convince the electorate that this level that we have seen here for a long time needs to go up. And those are the discussions that are taking place in many states and local governments across the country. If that does not happen, and I suspect that the ultimate resolution of this will be some combination of revenues and spending actions. So what's going to happen on the spending side? There are going to be choices to be made among the various programs that states and localities fund: education, healthcare, transportation, public safety, the social safety net. So where is the progressive community going to be in that discussion? We, I think, are seeing such a polarized discussion in this country. There's one side of the political spectrum that is happy to talk about revenues, another side that is happy to talk about what to do on the spending side. I suggest to you that what is going to happen here will probably be something in the nature of what President Obama is going to talk about tomorrow. Some people won't like that, but that is likely to be the reality. So the question becomes, what is going to be the role of the progressive community in looking at education dollars and asking how we can spend them better? Should we be paying teachers more for the fact that they have a master's degree when the evidence seems to suggest that that does not make someone a better teacher? What can we do about Medicaid? Beyond the idea of having the federal government take over more of the cost, how can we use those dollars better? I will point to one, what I think many people here will consider a positive note. In the realm of public safety, states in recent years have been ratcheting down the size of their prison systems. And a lot of people have said for a long time, we put too many people in prison, we spend too much. We are finally scaling back, really driven by a budgetary need as opposed to any change in social thinking. But these are occasions, these are opportunities when new thinking can arise. And I think, again, the question for the progressive community is, what are the choices that can be made on both the revenue and expenditure side? These are far too important questions to leave to the other side of the agenda. Thank you.
Well, thanks. I'm going to return to a point that Bob made about how there are differences in different parts of the country in how we raise this revenue, differences between places like Mississippi and Massachusetts, and sort of ask the question, well, he was asking the question whether or not we're going to raise revenue or cut expenses. I'm going to ask what happens if we raise revenue in different ways, in particular if we rely on regressive taxation as opposed to progressive taxation for revenue raising. Who gets hurt if the answer to the problems in the states is fees and sales taxes as opposed to property tax or income tax? There's a big difference, even if the revenue is the same, in the consequences of those different methods for raising revenue. It's not neutral, and in particular, it has huge consequences for the poor. If we had more time, I would take you through some of the ways in which tax regimes are related to things like health outcomes, educational attainment, teenage childbearing, crime, and so on. We won't have time for that today, but I'm just going to try and walk you through some of the great differences there are by region. And I'm going to take you back a little bit historically to argue that these differences are very long-standing. And it matters because some of the legislative history out there in the states imposes limitations on how revenue can be raised. Almost regardless of who's in charge politically, there are some real barriers out there. You're all familiar with Proposition 13. I'm going to take you backwards and regionally to tell you that that's actually a more recent story. There's a long history behind this. So if we go back to the period after the Civil War, after the Radical Reconstruction, that's where we find the beginning of Proposition 13-like limitations on spending and tax increases. So way back in 1875, Alabama becomes the first state to pass a constitutional limit on property tax and education spending, and institutes a statewide referendum required to approve any state or local tax increase in 1901. So way predating Proposition 13, we have the introduction of very severe limits and supermajority rules that make it very difficult to raise any kind of progressive taxes, leaving things like sales tax the only real instrument for raising tax at all. This is followed by Louisiana with a constitutional limit on property tax and spending in the 1870s. In the Great Depression, these supermajority rules start to spread to Arkansas, and then the Civil Rights Movement, the coming of the Civil Rights Movement leads other southern states to erect barriers to taxation, knowing full well that if there was a greater degree of political power in the black community, they would see increased tax expenditures for the public sector. So Louisiana, Mississippi, and Florida all invoke civil rights era supermajority rules, which generally speaking applied to the progressive suite of taxes, especially property tax, but also income tax. When we get to the 1970s, that's where we see Proposition 13 and its ilk, which spreads to other western states, so that today both the West and the South look much more like one another than they used to in the past, in having these supermajority rules in place. Well, what are the consequences of this kind of spreading limitation? First, it creates inertia. If you are in a low tax state to begin with, you don't tend to grow your tax base, and neighboring states are very eager to lower their rates so as not to lose advantages. And so you get a kind of vortex effect, and that's certainly been true in the South and in the West. But most of all, as I said, supermajority rules tend to hold down progressive taxes and really leave only one device or one set of devices, regressive taxes, for raising more revenue. This will clip the wings even of progressive governors. So when Clinton became governor of Arkansas, he wanted to do something about the abysmal record of Arkansas schools by pumping money in, and how was he going to do that? He ended up forced into a corner and raised sales taxes after having tried various other options and failed miserably and nearly lost several elections over it. Same thing's happening in California. So it's not even just the politics of the moment, it's the politics of the past invading the possibilities of the moment. So what has this meant for the way in which we've spent and raised revenue over time? I'm going to show you some data for the past 25 years or so and try and persuade you that this is actually quite consequential. So first look at state and local direct expenditures per capita. As Bob said before me, there's actually been a very steady increase in state spending over the last 25 years or so. Government spending at both the state and local level has nearly doubled across the board, and that's after adjusting for inflation. And a lot of this direct expenditure has been driven by social expenditures, by increases in spending on education, on public welfare, on health and hospitals. And federal spending on these programs has increased as well, but a lot of that federal funding, as we are hearing a lot in the last week or so, for example, Medicaid comes with very heavy matching requirements at the state and local level. So where does the revenue come from in the states for these increased responsibilities? Well, there are huge regional differences in where that revenue comes from. So if you look at that orange line at the bottom, that's the South. And what this graph is telling you is that over the last 25 years or so, very little of the answer to that question about increased spending is coming from individual income tax. Although the rate has increased over this 25-year period, the level was the lowest in the South to begin with, and it stayed that way persistently over this whole long period of time. Meanwhile, you can see the Northeast, that green line, arcing up in terms of the tax revenue, individual income tax. So the Northeast was turning to income tax, and the South was definitely not doing so. Well, what about corporate tax revenue? Both the South and the West refrained from making corporate income tax revenue the answer to those state spending requirements. So that's not really the answer they chose either. And finally, property tax doesn't seem to be a very popular source in the South either. It has long maintained the nation's lowest tax rate for state and local property tax. So what's the answer then? Where's the revenue going to come from to meet increased federal spending matching requirements? Well, when we look at the general sales tax revenue per capita, we see a completely different picture here. Throughout the country, with the exception of the Northeast, the regressive solution appears to be the favored choice for increasing revenue, with the West and the South leading the way in using the instrument of sales taxes as the major mechanism for increasing revenues that are driving that spending. In both of those regions, in the West and in the South, the presence of those supermajority rules that I talked about make it very hard to raise any other kind of revenue. And hence, if you're going to raise it to match those federal requirements, this is the mechanism by which you will do so. So that when we get to this graph, this is 2006 data, this is looking at the composition of tax structure, tax revenue from one region to the next. And as you can see, if you look on the left-hand side, the Northeast, for its tax package, if you will, relies primarily on property and income tax to generate most of its revenue. The South, by contrast, and increasingly the West, relies much more heavily on sales taxes, with revenue from the general sales tax comprising nearly a third of all state and local revenues. And the West, as I said, is catching up. I'm particularly concerned, as a scholar interested in poverty, in the role of taxation on food as part of this picture. So sales tax, of course, applies to virtually everything you purchase. but it really varies how much we rely on sales tax on food to compose the state and local revenue base. And so if you look at the states in green here, you'll see the states that tax food for home consumption. And the very dark green states, Alabama and Mississippi, are the two states in the country that tax food like any other good and tax groceries at the full state and local tax rate, which can be as much as 12% in Alabama. That's a very high rate of taxation. And what that means is that you are shifting the diet of people who are most sensitive to those kinds of expenditures. So if I were to throw up a series of maps, which I have, but no time to show them to you, of obesity, of heart disease, of hypertension, you would see this big cloud hovering over the southern states. And one of the reasons it's hovering there is that by collecting tax revenue in this way and causing poor people to shift their diets, especially in a negative direction, you end up with a stroke belt wrapped around the South. And so there are huge health consequences and health expenditure consequences that follow from the use of regressive taxation, especially food tax. Well, why does this matter so much for people at the poverty line? Now I want to walk you through what has happened to sales tax liabilities by region over this same time period, and you'll see just how dramatically different the regions of the country are. So this is looking at a sort of prototypical family of three at the poverty line in the southern states between 1982 and 2008. And what you see here is a pretty strong increase in the sales taxes exacted on a family at the poverty line, the sales taxes of poverty line in the South. Now let's take a look at what happened in the Northeast. This is a totally different picture. There's the South arcing up from where it was in 1980, and this is what's happened in the Northeast. Huge declines in revenues that are in tax liabilities, in income tax liabilities in particular, at the poverty line. What this means is that the northeastern states have been using the tax code as a redistributive mechanism. They have been following the federal government in enacting state-earned income tax credits, and not only depressing the tax to zero, they're depressing it way below zero and creating a rebate system that is creating huge differences by region. So if you are a family at the poverty line in Massachusetts, you are getting a rebate equivalent to $2,300 a year different from a family in Mississippi. That's an enormous difference at the poverty line. That's $2,300 on a family income of $18,000 is a huge, huge difference. And that is the operation of the state income tax code in the Northeast, depressing income tax required of poor families, while the South has basically gone the other direction. So there's this is what's happened to the overall state income tax liability for families in the South. It's gone up, and no state goes below zero. No state is creating a rebate system, whereas in the Northeast, most of them are creating a rebate system. What worries me most in the current context is that many of the instruments, especially the Earned Income Tax Credit, that have created a more progressive picture in the Northeast are under threat as the state and local governments are responding to the kind of fiscal pressures you've been hearing about. So for example, Rick Snyder in Michigan has proposed eliminating entirely the state earned income tax credit. In Kansas, lawmakers have proposed cutting the state's earned income tax credit by about 75%. Lawmakers in Utah are working to restore the state sales tax on food. Georgia is considering a state sales increase on a lot of goods, including groceries. 13 cities in the state of California have already adopted increases in sales tax rates that are slated to go into effect this month. And the cities in California are not alone. Sales tax increases are being debated in localities all across the country, from Arizona to Nebraska to North Carolina. So what this means at the end of the day, almost done, is that we're going to see, I think, a real repeal, if you will, or walking back from the very instruments that separated the progressive states that enacted those earned income tax credits from the more regressive ones that relied heavily on sales taxes, and probably a real depression in what is available to support the household expenses of poor families in particular. This, of course, is not having a neutral effect on federal expenditures, though we may see this change as Washington goes to work on these problems. The revenue flow from the federal government to the South, for example, is climbing. Relative to other regions of the country where it's largely flat or falling, the South has seen a very sharp uptick in federal spending per dollar of federal taxes paid. But this federal rescue has not been enough to reverse or stem the tides of poverty, to stem the impacts that I mentioned on teenage childbearing, on obesity, on health outcomes that are affecting the poor as a consequence of the kind of tax regime we use to float the public sector. So the rescue of the federal government is insufficient, but in the meantime, the problems accruing in the states are not just their problem, they're our problem, as we rush to the rescue with federal dollars, or have done up until now, largely to the southern states and increasingly to the west. So I guess the point I'm trying to make here is that the overall political context within which the discussion about the fiscal crisis of the states is taking place is one in which there are extreme limits on what the states can do, on the instruments available to them, because of this very long history of invoking supermajority rules like what you're familiar with with respect to Proposition 13. And I think over time we're going to see, however we solve the revenue versus deficit problem, we're going to see a change in the mix of the way we achieve that revenue that's going to have severe consequences for the most disadvantaged American families.
Thanks. It's a pleasure to be here in this city and talking about California's particular slant. I think our three presentations fit together very nicely, and let me see how I'm going to control this thing. I think it looks like the old-fashioned way. I want to start by, I think people are tending to panic a little bit in thinking about the situation and where we are, and I wanted to start with a couple of quotes, and you'll see that this is a very dramatic thing that could have come from the office of Mr. Ryan, for example, but you will note that it's actually said by Federal Reserve Chair Arthur Burns in 1972, worrying about the out-of-control spending. And he was in turn in dialogue in a certain way with a critique of federal policy, of fiscal policy, that talked about how we should make it more like supply and demand. And we have, if a scholar from outer space could see governments as, apart from their citizens, imposing taxes on individuals, and that the idea of positive public finance is in predicting the effects of taxes, all of them bad. Now, this, for the record, came from none other than James Buchanan, one of the founders of the public choice approach. It's important to keep this context in mind because this is the political context with which we're working. Okay, I'm going to talk about California, and I'm going to kind of